Right now, the Ukrainian armed forces have created hell for the Russians. Crimea has been torn apart, and the south of Ukraine has become a graveyard for enemy equipment. The 112th Brigade of the Russian Federation has been wiped out. The enemy's losses are colossal. Moscow is in shock. Raids, mobilization, and panic. Meanwhile, in Chechnya, there's a tough clash. Kadyrov is being ousted, and the power transition has already begun. Sensational proposal. Ukraine will be divided into sectors. What kind of nonsense is this? All this and more in our episode Hotspot. Crimea is ablaze. Russia in panic reports a mysterious attack by 2 drone aircraft. What was it, really? In the south, the Ukrainian armed forces repelled a massive assault, turning a column of enemy equipment into scrap metal. But that's not all. The Ukrainian armed forces steamrolled over a Russian brigade, leaving no trace of it. We are telling you all about it right now.
Last night, the Ukrainian armed forces consolidated their successes and struck again at the location of the 112th Guards Brigade of the Russian Armed Forces in Shuya. This brigade was involved in the attack on Sumy on Palm Sunday, which claimed the lives of dozens of Ukrainians. Explosions were heard and a fire broke out on the territory of the military criminals on the night of Thursday. Preliminarily, it hit the hangars where Iskander missiles are stored.
It's burning a little bit.
By the way, the attack on Sumy is not the only crime committed by these murderers of the civilian population in Ukraine.
It should be noted that the 112th Guards Missile Brigade is also involved in other high-profile acts of international terrorism on the territory of our country. In particular, it was the missile operators of this brigade who carried out the strike on the village of Groza in the Kharkiv region, resulting in the death of 59 local residents.
And as it should be, every war criminal receives a fitting payment for their crimes. The occupiers paid the price both for Sumy and for Kharkiv.
After this terrorist act, in January 2025, the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine stated that in Russia, as a result of an explosion, the battery commander of the 112th Missile Brigade Division, Captain Konstantin Nagaiko, was seriously injured. According to reports from the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, he was involved in this act of international terrorism.
Ukrainian military reports that on April 16th, the Russians launched a large-scale assault on Ukrainian positions using a significant amount of armored vehicles and personnel in southern Ukraine. Aerial reconnaissance timely detected the enemy's movement. The attack was repelled with drones and artillery. As a result of the combat actions, the enemy lost 29 pieces of equipment, 140 personnel, and 3 tanks were also damaged. The occupiers are also having restless nights in the temporarily occupied Crimea. Recently, they were visited by aircraft-type drones as claimed by the occupiers themselves. It was claimed that the UAVs were allegedly shot down by Russian air defense forces. However, no confirmation of this was provided. The Ukrainian side did not comment on these reports, and local telegram channels did not report hearing any explosion sounds.
Aircraft-type UAVs differ from other types of drones by having a longer duration and range of flight at higher speeds. These characteristics allow aircraft-type UAVs to be used in situations where the device needs to remain airborne for an extended period to achieve the longest route. It should be noted that the Ministry of Defense of the occupying country confirmed the fact of successful attacks by Ukrainian UAVs on military targets in Crimea.
Since August 2022, the sounds of explosions have been heard almost daily in Crimea. The Russian authorities explain this by shooting at Ukrainian drones, the work of air defense, or the exercises of the Russian military themselves. The self-proclaimed head of Crimea, Sergei Aksyonov, noted that drones are the main threat to Crimea. By the way, there is more bad news for the occupiers. Recently, the Ukrainians released new B-1 UAVs. These are light bombers designed to target personnel, vehicles, and armored equipment, as well as other military objectives both at the front line and behind enemy lines. Angry like a caged beast, the occupiers may continue their harsh shelling of Ukraine on Easter, according to Lithuanian Foreign Minister Kęstutis Budrys.
Such possibilities cannot be ruled out, especially since today, the occupying country's army launched a missile strike on our territory. using both Iskander-M and OO missiles from the S-300 anti-aircraft missile system, which has been upgraded to strike ground targets. And this is evidence that the Russian Federation will continue to use terror tactics against civilians.
Terror and blackmail are the only things Putin is good at. After all, his army is losing on the battlefield. The Kremlin dictator understands this clearly and deliberately violates the rules and norms of warfare. According to analysts, the Russian Federation can continue fighting for about another year and a half. But how will they fight? By piling up the land with the bodies of recruits that the Kremlin gathers for its purposes during the spring draft. This last part fits more with the realities of modern Russia.
In recent weeks, Ukrainian defense forces have liberated about 16 square kilometers of territory in the area of 3 settlements, Udakne, Kotlin, Shevchenko in the Donetsk region. This was reported by the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Oleksandr Syrsky.
The enemy has not changed its plans to push the units of the armed forces of Ukraine beyond the borders of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions and reach their administrative boundaries. However, the enemy's plan remains unfulfilled. We continue the defensive operation, conduct counteroffensive actions, and have certain successes. Oleksandr Syrsky, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Facebook.
The Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine also noted that since the beginning of this year, about 5,000 artillery systems of the Russian occupiers have already been destroyed.
The losses in artillery are related to the fact that they extensively use artillery adhering to the second wave of war, which they are taking from storage bases. It significantly falls short in range, not only compared to Western models, but also to Soviet artillery. Soviet models, which are still in principle present, and at the disposal of the Ukrainian army, and are also widely available, so to speak, at the disposal of the Russian army.
Tank units of the 1st Separate Tank Siversk Brigade continue to inflict damage on the invaders. In the video, a Ukrainian tank destroys an enemy position. Meanwhile, the Russian army attempted to hit the tank with artillery fire, but unsuccessfully. The Ukrainian crew returned without losses. Nevertheless, the Russian occupiers continue their attempts to advance on the front, particularly in the Lyman direction, assaulting in the areas of the settlements of Novoe, Novomikhailivka, and Yanpolevka. In the Toretsk direction, the Russian army unsuccessfully tried to penetrate the defense of the Ukrainian armed forces in the areas of Toretsk, Ozaryanivka, and Druzhba. The Pokrovsky direction remains the hottest. There, the Russian occupiers attempted to push back the Ukrainian defenders in the areas of the settlements of Sukaya Balka, Zelenopol, Yelizavetovka, Novotoretske, Kotlino, and Uspenovka. Ukrainian soldiers delivered a precise strike on the invaders' positions on the Eastern Front direction. Operators of strike drones from the special unit of the National Guard Special Purpose Center Wings of Omega destroyed a Russian howitzer and communication equipment of the Russian army. And in the south, Ukrainian defenders repelled a large-scale Russian assault. The enemy deployed at least 320 soldiers, 40 armored vehicles, 3 tanks, and about 10 buggies. According to the defense forces of southern Ukraine, strike drones and artillery were used to repel the attacks. The battle lasted more than 2.5 hours. Ukrainian defenders actively targeted the attackers with fire. As a result, the Russian army lost 29 pieces of equipment, 140 personnel, and 3 tanks were damaged.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now. Urgent. Ukraine is being targeted for division. The world is shaken by new statements. Trump's special representative Keith Kellogg proposed dividing Ukraine into sectors, following the post-war Germany model. What exactly do they want to impose on Kiev? How did the parties react? Watch all the shocking details right now.
The plan to divide Ukraine into parts from Donald Trump's team. Several global media outlets erupted with such headlines.
Trump's envoy. Ukraine could be divided like post-war Berlin.
A few hours later, the direct author of the plan, Keith Kellogg, issued a denial.
The article in the Times distorts what I said. I was talking about resilience forces after a ceasefire in support of Ukraine's sovereignty. When I mentioned demarcation, I meant areas or zones of responsibility for Allied forces without the involvement of American troops. I did not mean the division of Ukraine.
In fact, Kellogg's plan, which it should be reminded comes from one of the most pro-Ukrainian politicians in Trump's circle, is not about dividing Ukrainian territories, but about how European troops can be stationed in Ukraine.
Kellogg, of course, but provided a rather unfortunate example. with post-war Germany, but how even for a very basic reason, though, unlike the division of post-war Germany, which was defeated, it was a state, an aggressor state. Exactly. And Ukraine, firstly, is not defeated, and secondly, is not an aggressor state, but quite the opposite, a victim of aggression.
The Kellogg Plan once again confirms the White House has decided to distance itself as much as possible from the Russian-Ukrainian war. Trump's special representative suggests deploying European troops in the western part of Ukraine, while the entire front line, along which a 30-kilometer buffer zone should be established, is controlled by the Ukrainian armed forces. Kellogg separately notes that Washington will not provide any ground forces to implement this scenario.
This plan does not include a military contingent from the United States of America, but there is a very important positive but for us. The fact that the function of basic coordination is provided for, including from the United States of America.
This is important from the perspective that European leaders, while declaring their readiness to send troops, even without the participation of the American contingent, spoke about the necessity of US involvement in other matters, coordination, logistics, and technical equipment.
The United Kingdom will play its role in any peacekeeping mission in Ukraine, but it will only be able to do so with certain support from the United States. I am absolutely convinced that we need a lasting peace, not just a ceasefire. And for that, we need security guarantees.
While Russia, according to the Kellogg Plan, receives partial legalization of its troops' presence in the occupied territories of Ukraine, Kyiv receives European armies on its territory, which, with proper technical support, could take over some of the responsibilities assigned to the armed forces of Ukraine.
For this, of course, air defense systems are needed. For this, a significant strengthening of air power is required. And for this, serious preparation is needed in case of a renewed attack by the Russian Federation. In such a case, Ukraine will be able to free up some resources, both human and air defense and missile defense systems, from those cities that will essentially come under the protection of the peacekeeping contingent, including the very long border with Belarus, where part of our forces is also tied up, and redeploy them to more relevant sections of the front for us.
If only the issue of resolving the Russian-Ukrainian war could be settled with freezing and other simple recipes from Kellogg and Witkoff, it would have long been approved by Trump, whose method in international politics is self-isolation in his American bubble and disengagement from external irritants.
A harsh reckoning has once again caught up with the Russian Federation Guards for the atrocities in Sumy. The 112th Brigade, the very one that delivered a deadly blow to civilians, was completely destroyed by the Ukrainian armed forces. These unique shots are truly shocking. Yet even now, Putin's soldiers act on the principle of strike your own so that others fear you. Russian planes dropped bombs on their own Belgorod region. All the details are coming up.
Revenge did not take long. These are the shots of the shelling of the 112th Guards Rocket Brigade. This is the same brigade that was killing Ukrainians in the city of Sumy on Sunday. Well, there you have your answer. I almost gave birth. I have goosebumps. Interestingly, for the protection of such an object, the Russians spared the air defense and unsuccessfully tried to shoot down drones with rifles. As they say, air defense in Russia is only for the chosen ones. And the drones, as you can see, are hitting the target precisely. Let us remind you that earlier, the Ukrainian armed forces struck the permanent base of the 448th Missile Brigade of the occupiers in the Kursk region, who are also involved in the attack on Sumy. And at this time, Crimea also trembled. The Ministry of Murders of the Russian Federation claims that Crimea was attacked by 2 aircraft-type UAVs. And by the way, deep state analysts claim that the Ukrainian armed forces have started using the latest Ukrainian ultralight unmanned aerial system, B-1 at the front.
The B-1 UAVs are light bombers, designed to destroy personnel, vehicles, and armored equipment. In addition, it should be noted that these UAVs can destroy the specified targets both at the front line and in the enemy's rear. According to the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, these drones can carry various types of munitions and, most importantly, they are equipped with powerful low-noise engines that allow these UAVs to stay airborne for several hours. In addition, the B-1 has increased resistance to electronic warfare systems.
Moreover, the Ukrainian army is repelling a daring enemy attack in the Novopavlovsk direction. As you can see, the Russians are launching an attack with more than 24 armored vehicles, several tanks, and more than 12.5 BMPs with infantry. But all of this was shattered to pieces, along with the enemy infantry. And while the Ukrainian armed forces are striking the enemy, the Russians are hitting their own, as they say, to make others fear. At least 8 aerial bombs have been dropped by Russian planes on the Belgorod region since April 11th. One of the villages was attacked twice.
Since the beginning of 2025, according to estimates from the Russian side itself, there have been at least 59 unplanned bomb drops, including 44 FAPs and 7 UMPBs, and 3 missiles that have fallen from Russian planes on both Russian territory and temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. This is evidence that the Russian Federation is effectively facing the issue of the inability to modernize and conduct current major repairs of the Russian Aerospace Forces aircraft due to sectoral sanctions from the United States and EU countries.
Moreover, North Korea continues to assist Putin in his aggressive war against Ukraine. According to Reuters, over the past 2 years, North Korea has sent the Kremlin about 16,000 containers with ammunition.
It should be noted that North Korea supplies the Russian Federation not only with artillery shells. I will emphasize once again, according to the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, this amounts to about 4 million Hudson artillery shells. But accordingly, we are talking about the supply of KN-23 tactical ballistic missiles. Plus, accordingly, there are strike drones. In addition, the North Korean side also supplies, accordingly, the Hoksan 170mm self-propelled artillery and other types of military equipment.
And you remember, North Korea helps Russia not only with ammunition, but also sends its cannon fodder to the war.
There is real chaos in Moscow, street raids, and a mass hunt for conscripts. Mobilization has started, even though the Kremlin is hiding it. While young Russians are being packed into buses, the Russian elite is hastily obtaining Serbian passports. On the lists are people of Kadyrov, Patrushev, and others. The elites are fleeing the sinking ship. And what about Kadyrov himself? The power transition in Chechnya is already in full swing. Are there really names of potential successors? Watch right now.
Mass mobilization in Moscow. The police have started rounding up men on the streets of the city and even in the metro.
And here, they will catch, capture, and imprison you.
And the reason for all this is Putin's new innovation, the so-called non-cancelable summons. According to the bill, conscripts for mandatory service can now be taken based on a single decision of the draft campaign per year.
Why the mass mobilization, OAM, is understandable? They lack people, and all methods have already been employed, right? They've sent all the migrants. They could to the front. Yes, by the way, the money is running out because the regions have already started to reduce all these crazy payments. So in such a situation, who is left? Conscripts. Why in Moscow? Well, Moscow is the largest city. And to think that Moscow will completely avoid all this? No, it won't.
Meanwhile, the Russian elites have started to massively obtain Serbian passports, including the head of Chechnya, Kadyrov, and the Kremlin aide, Patrushev. The point is that citizenship of the country grants access to EU countries and 100 others.
It's not necessary to run anywhere. Yes, guarantees, of course, are also good. But they want to move freely around the EU. And accordingly, a separate question is whether a person under personal sanctions will be allowed in. That's a separate question. I haven't studied it yet. Well, they won't be given a visa, right? And once you get the passport, you can travel wherever you want. Another question is whether the EU might react to this and introduce a visa.
Well, what's happening with the transfer of power in Chechnya? As reported, the power transition project in Chechnya is in full swing. 2 or 3 candidates are being considered for the head position. But here's the problem. Adam Kadyrov is not among them.
In my opinion, Adam has absolutely nothing to do there. It's another matter that Ramzan wants Adam to be there. Moreover, he specifically wants to transfer power to Adam. However, Putin does not agree with this. And as some sources say, this is precisely where they disagreed with Putin, after which Ramzan ran off to Arab countries to set up backup plans, which further angered Putin.
The hunt for migrants in Russia continues. Law enforcement officers conducted a raid in a bathhouse complex in the early hours of the morning, apprehending and temporarily holding about 40 visitors, mostly from Kyrgyzstan. Now Kyrgyzstan is demanding explanations from Russia. But is this just a coincidence? After all, as reported by the Ministry of Labor of Kyrgyzstan, in the first 2 months of the year, they have made over 100 visits to police stations in Moscow and participated in 9 court cases in the interests of Kyrgyz citizens.
Of course, this is absolutely not a coincidence, and it is primarily related to the fact that Moscow lacks people on the front line. Therefore, they are rounding up all the migrants, and if they manage to detain them in a police station, they beat them, torture them, and so on, forcing them to sign a contract with the Ministry of Defense. This is the main story. Yes, essentially. That is applied to almost everyone.
Meanwhile, Dmitry Medvedev feels quite comfortable. His funds, specifically 4 of them, earned a record 8 billion rubles in the 3rd year of the full-scale war. And of course, all for himself. A bathhouse and a hunter's cabin were built at his dacha.
The money still primarily comes from oil and gas revenues today. And essentially, precisely because the price of oil is starting to fall, the amount of money will decrease. Well, specifically speaking, of course, the money comes from the budget. For his close associates, Putin spares no budget money, but more broadly, it's money from the pockets of ordinary Russians. Well, ordinary Russians should understand this perfectly.
Could it be that Putin will announce the end of the war before May 9th? This is exactly what many media outlets and Telegram channels are saying. But you wouldn't say that from Putin's statements.
Every year, before May 9th, we hear various speculations about what Putin will say in his speech at the parade. And every time he doesn't say it, well, almost every time. I don't think it will be any different this time. And I don't see any prerequisites for him to announce the end of the war on May 9th.
Meanwhile, Ukraine's allies are warning that the terrorist country might strike Ukraine on Easter. In particular, Lithuania's chief diplomat has no doubt that Moscow will decide on a more brutal attack than before.
It has become known that North Korea has supplied Russia with millions of shells. Over 20 months, Pyongyang has transferred more than 4 million munitions to Moscow, which are already being used against Ukrainian positions. Journalists have uncovered the scheme that is supplying the Russian army with new forces for offensives. How is North Korea strengthening the military capabilities of the Russian army? Watch.
In the last 20 months, North Korea has delivered at least 4 million artillery shells to Russia, which are actively used in the war against Ukraine, according to a new investigation by Reuters journalists. Investigators claim that the deliveries are happening on a large scale and systematically via sea and rail routes, and this has significantly strengthened the military capabilities of the Russian army.
In addition to artillery shells, North Korea has provided the occupying country's army with Koksan self-propelled guns of 170 millimeters, but primarily ballistic missiles KN-23. These are the means of destruction with which the Russian occupiers are terrorizing peaceful Ukrainian cities. In addition, the transfer of multiple rocket launcher systems and other military equipment has been recorded.
The material notes that North Korea has become one of the key sources of ammunition for the Russian Federation. And the scale and systematic nature of the arms supplies highlight a new level of military-political cooperation between the two countries.
The North Korean ground forces alone number more than 1 million military personnel. Regarding North Korea's military-industrial complex, it should be noted that it is currently effectively repurposed to meet the needs of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, providing both artillery shells and accordingly strike drones and means of destruction.
According to experts, this is a serious problem faced by the armed forces of Ukraine. However, it is also not appropriate to say that North Korea's military potential is limitless.
The point is that the 4 million shells supplied by North Korea are apparently shells that were produced in the 20th century. There is such a concept as 3 categories of shells. That is, the first category is a 100% result, and accordingly, the second and third categories are about 40 to 60%.
Last summer, an occupying unit that was based at the time in the Zaporizhzhia direction reported that almost 50% of the shells fired by its D-20 howitzers were North Korean 152mm shells, and 100%, meaning all the 122mm caliber rockets, were also North Korean.
The 4 million shells that have already been supplied from North Korea for the needs of the Russian Federation have very low tactical and technical characteristics, as evidenced by data from the Russian side itself. Speaking of the capabilities of North Korea's economy, for comparison, the European giant Rheinmetall can produce about 700,000 shells annually. This is taking into account the reconstruction of the main production facilities. Therefore, there is no basis to talk about millions of shells being produced by North Korea's economy.
It should also be remembered that North Korea is only an auxiliary supplier for the Russian military-industrial complex, not the main one. Military production in Russia, although under the pressure of sanctions, continues to operate and even grow. As of the year 2025, 4.5 million people are working for the needs of the occupying army. At the time of the Russian Federation's invasion of Ukraine, Russia had about 15 million artillery shells stored in its warehouses.
That's all for now. But for more fiery news from the front, watch the next episode.